Back in the courtroom, the air crackled with anticipation. The defense attorneys, sleek and confident, stood to address the bench. Their lead counsel, a sharp-suited man with an unyielding gaze, began, "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the gravity of this morning's unfortunate incident, we must respectfully request a recusal. It is abundantly clear that the presiding judge is personally compromised, and continuing this hearing would create a significant conflict of interest, tainting the proceedings." He spoke with a practiced cadence, attempting to twist the narrative, to turn the victim into the obstacle to justice. Judge Vance let him finish, her expression unreadable. Then she leaned forward, her voice calm but steel-edged. "Counselor, are you suggesting that because I was assaulted this morning, I am incapable of carrying out the duties of my position? With all due respect, Your Honor, your emotional involvement—" "The emotional involvement?" Judge Vance cut him off, her voice rising slightly, the very air in the courtroom seeming to thicken. "Let us be clear, Counselor. I was publicly assaulted, humiliated, not for what I said, not for what I did, but for who I am. Because someone saw a black woman walking into a courtroom and decided she couldn't possibly hold power, couldn't possibly be worthy of dignity. That, Counselor, is bias, and that is why this court will proceed. You know what real bias looks like, Counselor? Real bias is a man using clippers to shave off a woman's hair without cause, without warrant, and without a single question about her name. Real bias is 12 ignored complaints from people who look like me, buried by this very institution." She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the defense table. "This court," she declared, her voice resonating with unshakable authority, "will not recuse itself. My personal experience today does not cloud my judgment, it sharpens my vision. This court is here to seek justice, and justice will be served. You may continue with your defense, but do not mistake my resolve for compromise." The defense attorney, visibly shaken by her unwavering stance, could only nod curtly. The air in the room crackled with the undeniable shift of power. It was a powerful lesson for those who have felt unseen or dismissed. This moment was incredibly validating. Seeing someone like them not only acknowledged, but in a position of ultimate authority, using their own pain as a lens through which to demand accountability. Many victims of injustice are often re-victimized or blamed, their pain weaponized against them. Judge Vance's unyielding stance demonstrated the immense strength it takes to reclaim one's narrative and challenge systemic prejudice head-on. Outside the courthouse, a different kind of justice was brewing. The viral video had ignited a firestorm. What began as a local outrage had swelled into a national protest. Judge Vance's decision to proceed, to face her abuser from the bench, had become a rallying cry. From her chambers she could hear the distant roar of the crowd, a collective heartbeat. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to feel it all fully. The noise, the pressure, the truth rising to the surface after years of being buried under red tape and silence. Signs bobbed above the heads of a full crowd of protesters, community leaders, and citizens. Justice starts now. Protect black women. 12 complaints, 0 accountability. It was a powerful surge of solidarity, the community embracing her as one of their own, amplifying her voice into a roar. The public embrace was more than just noise. It was the engine driving the change. When enough people say no more, when enough eyes are watching, the system must respond. This collective uprising highlighted the profound impact of public exposure in forcing institutional accountability. When the world is watching, denial becomes impossible. For those who have experienced their own injustices being ignored or dismissed, the idea of going viral and forcing a reckoning is deeply satisfying. It's a validation that their stories matter. Later that afternoon, a soft knock on her chamber door. "Your Honor, Reverend Elijah Hayes to see you." Judge Vance nodded. Reverend Hayes was a towering figure in the Savannah community, his wisdom as deep as his voice. He walked in, his calm strength a balm in the chaotic day, his eyes tired but kind, reflecting years of fighting battles for his flock. "Judge Vance," he said, taking the seat she offered, "just wanted you to know we're out there. We see what you're doing, and we're with you." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, thick with handwritten notes. "This," he began, placing it on her desk, "is a list. Names, phone numbers, some little notes about what happened. These are folks who came to me over the years after they ran into Deputy Finch. Folks who were afraid to speak up, who were told it wasn't worth it, or that they'd just be dismissed as troublemakers." Judge Vance looked at the list, dozens of names, a silent chorus of untold pain, of quiet indignity. "These aren't just names, Reverend," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "These are the people this courthouse had ignored, who had been brushed off, laughed at, written off, but not anymore." The Reverend simply nodded. "No, Your Honor, not anymore. What you did today, you gave them permission. You showed them that their voices matter. And now, they're ready to speak." It was a profound truth. Judge Vance's stand had not only broken her own silence, but given permission for an entire community to break theirs too. It was a powerful example of collective trauma finding collective healing through shared voice. The flow of witnesses into the courtroom continued, but with a new tenor, each one a small act of defiance. And then came Marshal Samuel Green. He was a black U.S. Marshal with over 20 years of service, his uniform impeccably pressed, but he walked with a slight limp from an old injury. His face was a roadmap of quiet weariness and deep-seated regret. "Marshal Green, you've been working at this courthouse for over 2 decades. Have you ever encountered Deputy Finch?" the prosecutor began. Green looked directly at Judge Vance, his eyes solemn. "Yes, ma'am. Many times. We worked shifts together in security detail years ago." He paused, taking a slow, deep breath. "I saw a lot. Most of it I let slide. I didn't want trouble. Didn't want to be labeled the angry black officer for speaking out against a colleague." His voice was low, tinged with a raw, honest regret that silenced the courtroom. "But what I saw from Finch, the way he treated certain individuals, the casual disrespect, I should have reported it. I didn't, and I regret it every single day." He continued, describing specific instances where Finch had used excessive force or verbally abused people, particularly those of color, well before his actions had escalated to this morning's public assault. "I even filed a memo once about his conduct after an incident with a young man being processed. It disappeared. My supervisor told me Finch was the kind of man we want handling difficult people. Said I should learn to work with the team." His words painted a chilling picture of an internal system designed to sweep inconvenient truths under the rug, prioritizing conformity over integrity. "But today, Marshal, why are you speaking today?" Judge Vance asked, her voice gentle. Marshal Green looked around the packed courtroom, his gaze lingering on the faces in the gallery, then settling back on Judge Vance. "Because, Your Honor, what you did today, sitting in that chair after what they did to you, that's bigger than a bench. It's bigger than a uniform. You showed me what true courage looks like, and I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent one more minute." His words highlighted the difficult position of those within corrupt systems, the fear of being labeled, and the immense personal cost of complicity. His raw honesty spoke to a shared experience for many in the target audience, validating their own fears and the courage it takes to overcome them. As Marshal Green finished, the air was thick with the weight of unburdened truth. It was becoming clear that Finch was just a symptom, a visible wound in a much larger diseased body. The roots of this corruption ran deeper, reaching into places Judge Vance never expected. The next stage of the reckoning would be painful, personal, and would expose the true rot within the system. The courthouse may have been bustling, but in Judge Beatrice Vance's chambers, the silence felt colder, heavier than usual. It was the next morning, and Savannah's early fall sky was a muted gray, pressing down on the city like a warning. She sat at her desk, a thick manila folder in front of her. One marked confidential, internal records. It had been slipped to her by a court administrator who hadn't said a word, just nodded, left it on her desk, and walked out like it burned his hands to touch. Judge Vance opened it slowly. Inside were documents, memos, emails, signatures. The paper felt brittle, almost alive with the buried truths it held. 12 formal complaints filed against Deputy Sterling Finch over the last 15 years. Each one a story of disrespect, over-policing, intimidation, or outright assault. And then the crushing realization. All dismissed. All signed off by a name she knew too well. Judge Wallace Sterling. Her former mentor. Her sponsor into the federal circuit. The man who had once told her she was exactly what the bench needed. But now she saw his signature at the bottom of denial after denial, each form stamped with bureaucratic indifference. Allegation unsubstantiated. Lack of corroborating evidence. No further action required. The cold administrative language chillingly masked the human cost, the pain of those who had sought justice and found only a bureaucratic wall. And then, tucked at the very back of the folder, one memo stood out. A confidential communication between Judge Sterling and the head of courthouse security from 5 years ago. Judge Vance read it once, then again. It said, "Finch may be rough around the edges, but he keeps order, especially with certain groups. Best to leave well enough alone." Her fingers curled around the page until it crumpled, the paper protesting with a soft crunch. There it was. The quiet part, said out loud. The unvarnished truth of how the system actively protected its own, prioritizing a twisted sense of order over fundamental justice. It wasn't just about Finch anymore. It was the entire machine that had kept him safe, that had protected him, endorsed him, even encouraged him to get rougher, louder, crueler, so long as it served their definition of control. This was the ultimate betrayal, not just by a racist bailiff, but by the very hand that had guided her, by the institution she had sworn to serve. This was the moment of deepest personal pain and systemic clarity for Judge Vance. The betrayal from her mentor, someone she admired, transformed the conflict from individual to ideological. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't a case anymore. It was a purge. She looked down at her own reflection in the glossy desk, her uneven hair, her tired eyes. And yet, the fire still burned behind them. An unquenchable resolve. The philosophical weight of it all settled upon her. The concept of order being prioritized over justice, and how this could create a breeding ground for abuse. Justice delayed to preserve appearances, abuse tolerated in the name of order. This was the very rot she had come to expose. There was a knock, her clerk again. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "we've received a formal inquiry from the Senate Judiciary Committee. They're asking for your statement on judicial oversight failures tied to the Finch incident." Judge Vance gave a humorless smile. "Of course they are. Now that the cameras are rolling." The clerk hesitated. "There's more. 2 retired judges and 1 former district attorney just resigned this morning, citing health reasons." Judge Vance didn't respond. She just stood. "Bring in the attorneys, all of them. We're going to finish this today." An hour later, the courtroom was standing room only again, and this time it wasn't just locals. Reporters from the New York Times, the Washington Post, even the BBC were squeezed into the gallery. A row of young black law students sat shoulder to shoulder in the front pew, notebooks in their laps, eyes wide open. This was no longer just about Savannah. This was national now. Judge Vance took her seat, tapped the gavel. "This court is in session." She turned her attention to the room. "Before we proceed with closing arguments, I'd like to enter into the record new material provided to this court." She nodded to her clerk, who handed a copy of the folder to both tables. "This includes all complaints previously filed against Deputy Finch, all correspondence related to their suppression, and the names of every individual who signed off on dismissing them." The defense attorney tried to object, but Judge Vance raised her hand. "Sit down." The words were soft but final. She turned to the gallery. "Let the record show that this court is no longer interested in protecting institutions at the expense of individuals. We are no longer pretending that silence is neutrality." Her eyes swept the room. "Every signature in this folder represents a choice, not a mistake. A choice to ignore victims, to protect predators, to maintain an illusion of order built on fear." She looked directly into the defense attorney's face. "And it ends today." A hush fell over the room, so deep you could hear someone's pen stop mid-scratch. And then, from the far side of the room, a voice called out, "Your Honor?" It was a man in his 60s, standing hesitantly by the doorway. "May I speak?" There was a pause that stretched, taut with anticipation. Then Judge Vance gave a small nod. He stepped forward, hat in hand. "My name is Ellis Johnson," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I was arrested in this building in 2011 by Finch for raising my voice when my daughter's case was dismissed. He slammed me into a wall, broke 2 of my ribs." Judge Vance nodded. "Was a complaint filed?" "I filed it myself," Johnson confirmed, gesturing vaguely towards the front desk. "Right over there. And they told me I tripped and fell. That's what the report said. I never came back." He looked around the room, his eyes brimming. "But I'm here now." Judge Vance stood. "Anyone else?" A pause. Then, one by one, hands began to rise. 5, 10, 15 people. Every one of them with a story. Every one of them with a silence that had lasted too long. And now, finally, a voice. It was an ultimate twist, a powerful and unexpected climax. This spontaneous outpouring of new voices showed the immediate, tangible impact of Judge Vance's courage. A moment of collective catharsis where years of pain found their long-awaited release. Judge Vance didn't cry. She didn't smile. She didn't even move. She just watched as the truth rose all around her. Not whispered, not hidden, not protected by robes or badges, but spoken at last. The foundations of the courthouse, built on layers of silence and complicity, began to tremble. The final day of the hearing began with rain in Savannah. Not a soft drizzle, not a cleansing shower, but a relentless downpour, the kind that washed over the city like a warning and a reckoning at the same time. Streets flooded, power lines swayed, but still, they came. Reporters, protesters, clerks, interns, witnesses. They came with umbrellas, ponchos, cameras, and signs, because by now, everyone knew what was happening in that courtroom wasn't just justice. It was history. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed but electric. The air had a pulse, the kind you feel just before something irreversible happens. Judge Beatrice Vance walked into the courtroom in silence. No gavel yet, no declaration. She paused at the front of the bench, looked out at the packed gallery, and then she did something unexpected, something that seemed to hold the breath of the entire room. She took off her robe, folded it gently, and laid it across the chair. She stood there, no longer shielded by title or tradition, just a woman, scarred and standing. And then she spoke, her voice clear and resonant, filling the space without a microphone. I've sat behind this bench for years. I've worn the robe, carried the title, delivered rulings, followed procedure. But I've also stayed silent longer than I should have, and today, I'm done being quiet. He glanced to the defense table, to the prosecution, then to the courtroom full of citizens who had once been silenced, ignored, cast aside. This court finds Deputy Sterling Finch guilty of abuse of power, violation of civil rights, and official misconduct. There was no applause, only a profound silence, the kind that follows a bomb dropping. But it doesn't stop there. He stepped forward, her voice ringing with resolve. This court also recommends immediate review of every complaint ever filed under his name and formal investigation into any official who suppressed them. She turned to the court reporter. Put that on the record. Then, slowly, she reached for a folder beneath the desk, one that hadn't been opened yet. She held it up for everyone to see. This, she said, is a policy proposal, effective immediately. I am instituting a mandate for all bailiffs, marshals, and courthouse personnel under this jurisdiction. Her voice never wavered. It's called the Vance Mandate. A few heads lifted at the name, recognizing the weight of its implication. It requires comprehensive anti-bias training, psychological screening, regular evaluations, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior inside federal courthouses. She held it in the air, a declaration to the world. And I will take this to the circuit, to the judiciary, to the Senate, if I have to, because what happened to me should have never happened to anyone. And I'm going to make damn sure it never happens again. There was movement in the gallery now, small knots, silent tears, hands gripping one another in stunned solidarity. She continued, I want to make something very clear. This was never about revenge. It's about responsibility, accountability, about looking this broken system in the eye and saying, not anymore. She turned to the defense and to those who had allowed Finch to operate without consequence for over a decade. Consider yourselves on notice. She tapped the folder again. I will be forwarding recommendations for disbarment, formal review, and possible charges to the Department of Justice for every official who played a role in burying the truth. The courtroom didn't move. Couldn't move. Then Judge Vance looked up, just past the benches, toward the tall arched window behind the gallery. The storm was still raging outside, but light was beginning to filter through, a beam of sun breaking across the marble floor. She nodded once, as if accepting the timing. Before we conclude, there's one more piece of business. She looked to the side entrance. The officers opened the door, and Sterling Finch walked in, still in cuffs, no longer in uniform, his face pale, hollow, broken in a way that had nothing to do with bruises or beatings. He was led to the front, stood beside his public defender. Judge Vance faced him, not with vengeance, but with a quiet, burning fire. Mr. Finch, this court sentences you to the maximum allowable penalties under federal law: 6 years imprisonment for abuse of power, 5 years for civil rights violations, and an additional year for obstruction. She paused. But that's just the legal part. He didn't look up. And here's the human part. You spent your career deciding who was worthy of dignity and who wasn't. You thought the badge made you immune. That silence would shield you. That people like me would never hold the gavel. Her eyes locked onto his. Well, now you get to sit in the seat you made for others. No badge, no robe, just the weight of what you've done. She nodded to the officers. Take him away. As Finch was escorted out, the courtroom didn't clap. No one cheered. They just watched. because it wasn't about celebrating. It was about witnessing. And sometimes, that's more powerful than applause. Judge Vance looked down at the file again, the Vance mandate. She closed it, lifted her robe from the bench, and spoke one final time. Court is adjourned. The courthouse emptied slowly, like a storm clearing, one drop at a time. People didn't rush out. They lingered, quiet conversations, soft embraces. A few stopped to touch the banisters, the courtroom doors, as if grounding themselves to a place that had until now felt like a fortress too cold to ever bend. Judge Vance sat alone in her chambers. The file folders were gone. The courtroom was quiet. The robe hung on the back of her chair like it always did, but this time it felt different, lighter. Not because the burden was gone, but because it had been spoken out loud. She turned in her chair and faced the mirror behind her desk. Her reflection stared back. The uneven patches on her scalp had started to grow out. The silver coils that once crowned her head were coming back, but slowly, unevenly. There was a part of her that wanted to hide them, to cover the scars, to smooth over the pieces that still felt exposed. A knock broke her thoughts. It was her sister, Naomi. Naomi didn't say a word as she entered, just walked over and pulled a folding stool from the corner of the room. She set it behind Judge Vance, pulled out a small pair of clippers, and plugged them in. "You ready?" she asked, her voice soft, full of understanding. Judge Vance met her eyes in the mirror. There was no fear there anymore, just resolve. "Yeah," she whispered. "Let's finish it." Naomi moved slowly, gently. Each pass of the clippers was careful, deliberate. The remaining uneven strands fell away one by one, not in shame this time, not as an act of violence, but as a choice, a clean start. When Naomi was done, she handed Judge Vance a mirror. Judge Vance turned it over in her hand before finally looking. The reflection stared back, bold, bare, strong and beautiful. "You could rock that every damn day and still own every room you walk into," Naomi said with a grin. Judge Vance didn't answer right away, just stared at herself. "This is who I am now," she said softly. "No," Naomi corrected. "This is who you've always been. Now the rest of the world just caught up." They both smiled. The personal act of shaving her head marked the completion of her transformation, a powerful reclaiming of her identity on her own terms. That night, Judge Vance walked out of the courthouse without a wig, no scarf, no hat, just her head held high and bare under the city lights. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, a small group of onlookers spotted her. There were no cameras this time, no reporters, just people. One woman, maybe in her 70s, brown-skinned with thick glasses, stepped forward and gently placed her hand on Judge Vance's arm. "I never thought I'd live to see someone like you do what you just did," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Judge Vance took her hand. "You did more than survive," she said. "You paved the road." Behind her, a teenager approached shyly. No words, just a look. Then she pulled off her hoodie, revealing her own short, shaved head, and nodded. Judge Vance nodded back. Something passed between them, a silent inheritance, a profound understanding. The silent affirmations from the community and colleagues were powerful testaments to her impact, her shaved head a symbol of courage and authenticity. Later that night, Judge Vance stood on her front porch, looking out over her quiet neighborhood. Porch lights flickered gently. A wind stirred the oak trees. Inside, her phone buzzed. Dozens of texts, emails, news headlines, but she let them wait. Tonight wasn't about the noise. It was about finally hearing herself breathe. The next morning she returned to the courthouse, business as usual, at least on paper. But people noticed. The robes stayed off longer than usual. The stares lingered, but differently this time. Not in confusion, not in dismissal, but in recognition. When she stepped into the judge's elevator, the janitor nodded at her with a small fist to his chest, a gesture of pride. One of the younger security officers gave a subtle thumbs up, then quickly looked away, blushing. And when she entered the courtroom for a new hearing, just a routine civil dispute, the entire room stood before the clerk even announced her. That had never happened before. She nodded once and sat. The law didn't stop. There were more cases, more motions, more files, but something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't just in the rules, it was in the room. Justice had a new face now, and it didn't apologize for the space it took up. Judge Vance walked the halls differently. Not louder, not harsher, just fuller. Like someone who had been made to shrink for years and finally remembered what standing at full height felt like. The cameras still came. There were interviews she didn't do, headlines she didn't read. But one caught her eye a few days later, taped to the break room fridge. Federal judge refuses to back down after public assault. Launches historic reform from the bench. Someone had scribbled in Sharpie below it, "She's our judge." And that made her smile. She didn't set out to become a symbol. She set out to do her job. But somewhere along the way, standing her ground became something more. It became permission for others to stand too. Months passed. The courtroom that had once echoed with silence and fear now held something different. Not perfection, not peace, but presence. A different kind of stillness. The kind that came when people knew they would be heard. The Vance mandate had spread, first within the courthouse, then across the district. Other judges adopted it. Other cities called about it. A bill was being drafted in Congress. Judge Vance hadn't planned that, but then again, so much of what happened wasn't planned. She just hadn't backed down. That alone was enough to turn the tide. She kept working, day in, day out. Civil disputes, custody cases, tax hearings. But behind every decision now lived a deeper intention, a louder awareness. Not just what the law said, but who the law had ignored. One afternoon, Judge Vance stepped into a middle school classroom. The teacher had invited her to speak about justice, about courage. She expected 10 kids and some awkward silence. But the room was packed. They had watched the trial, read the articles. Some had written essays. Others made signs. There was one taped to the chalkboard that simply said, "Be like Judge Vance." She didn't speak long. She didn't need to. The kids asked the real questions. How do you stay calm when people hate you? What did it feel like when they cut your hair? Did you ever want to give up? She answered them all honestly, but the last one stuck with her. From a quiet girl in the corner, barely louder than a whisper. Do you still believe in the system? Judge Vance paused, her gaze thoughtful. And then she said, I don't believe in what the system was, but I believe in what it can become. And I believe in people like you asking that question. That's how it changes. When she left the school, she cried in the car for the first time in months. Not from pain, from hope. Not long after that, the White House called. Not for a soundbite, for something more. Judge Beatrice Vance had been chosen to receive the Presidential Medal of Justice. The ceremony would be televised. Speeches prepared. Dignitaries in the room. But none of that mattered to her. What mattered was who would be in the front row. Naomi, her clerk, her former intern Mara, now a first-year law student, and Reverend Hayes. And sitting in the far corner, surrounded by rows of suited officials, would be the quiet girl from the classroom, the one who asked the real question. The stage was large, white marble steps leading up to the podium. The president stood to the side. When Judge Vance stepped forward, the applause rose like a wave. But she didn't raise her hand, didn't wave. She simply stepped to the microphone and began, I wasn't supposed to be here. The room went still. Not because I wasn't qualified, not because I didn't earn it, but because for most of my life, systems like this one weren't built with people like me in mind. She looked out over the crowd, and when I finally stepped into the spaces I had worked my whole life to reach, I was still reminded that I didn't belong. A long breath. But I stayed. I stood, and I made them see me. She paused. I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because I was lucky enough to survive a moment that should have broken me, and because I knew too many others who didn't. A flashbulb clicked somewhere in the crowd. No, this medal isn't just mine. It belongs to every woman who was told to stay quiet. Every man who was told justice wasn't for him. Every child who looked at the law and saw only fear. This is for you. The applause that followed wasn't explosive, it was respectful, deep, like people clapping for something they finally understood. As the ceremony ended, Judge Vance stepped off the stage, and somewhere far away, in a state prison across the state line, Sterling Finch watched the broadcast from a small mounted television. He didn't blink, didn't move, didn't speak, just stared as the woman he had once tried to break stood before the nation and was honored for the very strength he tried to erase. The screen went black after the credits rolled. But the silence in the room stayed with him. Not punishment, just truth. And truth, it turns out, is the one thing he couldn't silence. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just a story about one woman or one courthouse. It was a story about dignity, truth, and what happens when we finally say, enough is enough. Judge Beatrice Vance didn't just uphold the law, she became the line in the sand. She reminded us that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about accountability. It's about the strength to rise after being stripped down, to speak when silence is easier, and to lead with integrity even when the system turns against you. For those of us who've lived long enough to see both change and resistance, this story hits deeper because we know real progress is slow, it's costly, and it demands courage from ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Maybe you've been through something like this. Maybe you've watched a loved one face injustice. Maybe you felt powerless in the face of it all. But this story shows power doesn't come from a badge or a title or even a bench. It comes from standing tall when the world tells you to shrink. So if this story moved you, if it made you feel seen or heard, or simply reminded you that change is still possible, please don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to our channel for more tales that challenge, inspire, and speak truth out loud. Because justice doesn't end in the courtroom. It begins with us, together, right now.